He raised a child to die and called it love. Spoilers ahead. There was a moment in the story where we realized a kindly mentor, the protector, the one figure who seemed to operate from pure wisdom, had been running a plan that required a 17-year-old boy to walk into a forest and let himself be killed. And the uncomfortable part was not that the plan was wrong. It was that it worked, and that changed the entire framework for evaluating what he did. Because if the outcome justified the method, then we were left asking whether care and manipulation could coexist in the same action, and whether someone could genuinely love a person while simultaneously treating them as a necessary sacrifice for a larger objective that they themselves had defined as greater than any individual life. Albus Dumbledore was not a villain, but he was also not the benevolent figure the surface narrative suggested. And the deeper we examined his decisions across 7 years of calculated moves, the more clearly we saw a man who learned a specific lesson from a traumatic early failure and then applied that lesson so rigidly that he recreated the same structural problem he originally tried to escape, the problem of deciding that he was uniquely qualified to determine what the greater good required, and who must pay the price for it. And this was where his psychology became disturbingly consistent, because every major choice he made reflected a man who believed he could not trust himself with power, but also believed no one else could be trusted with the information required to make the right choice. So he created a system where he held all the knowledge, distributed in fragments, and engineered conditions that forced other people to arrive at the conclusion he had already determined was necessary. The origin of this pattern was Grindelwald, and more specifically, the summer when a brilliant young man met an equally brilliant peer, and together they constructed a philosophy called the greater good, which in practice meant that wizard kind should rule over muggles for the muggles' own protection, and Dumbledore was seduced not by power itself, but by the idea that he was smart enough to wield it responsibly, that he could be the benevolent architect of a better world. And this lasted exactly as long as it took for his sister Ariana to die in a 3-way duel, where he never learned whose spell actually killed her, which meant he lived his entire adult life with the knowledge that his ambition, his arrogance, and his willingness to pursue a grand vision directly caused the death of the one person he was supposed to protect above all others. And this was a wound that never healed, the guilt that shaped every subsequent choice, because he decided in that moment that he could not be trusted with power, that his judgment was compromised by ambition, and therefore he had to operate from the shadows, never taking the positions of direct authority he was offered, always positioning himself as advisor, teacher, manipulator, the man who moved pieces but never sat on the throne himself. And this was where the Horcrux problem entered, because at some point between the First War and Harry's arrival at Hogwarts, Dumbledore began to suspect what Voldemort had done, and by the time he saw the diary in Harry's second year, he knew for certain that Voldemort had split his soul, and the question became how many pieces. And the research led him to 6, and then he saw Harry's scar, the connection, the Parseltongue ability, the way Voldemort's thoughts bled through, and he realized what Voldemort accidentally did on that Halloween night, which was that he made Harry himself into a Horcrux, a living container for a piece of soul that could not be destroyed without destroying the vessel. And this was a moment where Dumbledore understood that for Voldemort to die, Harry had to die. And he did not tell Harry this. Not in second year. Not in fourth year when Voldemort returned. Not in fifth year when he finally explained to the prophecy. Not even in sixth year when he took Harry on a Horcrux hunt. Because he had decided that Harry could only make the choice to die if he arrived at it himself. If he walked into that forest believing it was his own decision. Not a script written by someone else. The calculated nature of this became clear when we track what Dumbledore did and did not reveal, because he was not withholding information out of kindness or protection. He was withholding it because he believed the plan only worked if Harry did not know he was part of the plan. And this was a very specific form of manipulation that treated the other person's agency as a tactical problem to be managed rather than a right to be respected. And we saw this in how he placed Harry with the Dursleys, knowing they would mistreat him, because he needed Harry to grow up without arrogance, without a sense of entitlement, conditioned to accept suffering as normal, so that when the ultimate suffering was required, he would not resist out of self-preservation instinct. And this worked. The boy who lived in the cupboard became the boy who walked into the forest. But the fact that it worked did not change the fact that it required engineering a child to neglect as groundwork for an adolescent sacrifice. When Dumbledore put the Philosopher's Stone in Hogwarts in Harry's first year and designed protections that an 11-year-old could bypass, He was not protecting the stone. He was testing Harry, seeing if the boy would risk himself for others, confirming that the necessary psychological qualities were developing. And when Harry succeeded, Dumbledore's response was not surprise, but satisfaction. The satisfaction of seeing a hypothesis confirmed, and this pattern repeated, the Chamber of Secrets, where he allowed Harry to face a basilisk because he needed to see how Harry handled mortal danger. The Triwizard Tournament, where he knew something was wrong, but let it play out because Harry needed to experience Voldemort's return firsthand. The Department of Mysteries, where he allowed Harry to be lured into a trap because Harry needed to understand the cause of his own impulsiveness. And in each case, Dumbledore was balancing genuine care. He did not want Harry to die prematurely, with strategic necessity, which was that Harry had to be shaped into someone who would choose death when the moment came. The relationship with Snape was the other side of this, because Dumbledore took a Death Eater who came to him broken by guilt and grief, a man who loved Lily Potter and got her killed through his own choices, and he offered Snape a form of redemption that required absolute loyalty, complete secrecy, and a willingness to be hated by everyone, including the people he was protecting. And Snape agreed because guilt was a powerful motivator, and because Dumbledore was offering him the one thing he wanted, which was meaning extracted from his worst mistake. But the price was that Snape had to play a role so convincing that even Voldemort believed it. And this required Snape to kill Dumbledore himself when the time came, which Dumbledore framed as a mercy. He was dying anyway from the curse on the ring, slow and painful, but which also served Dumbledore's larger tactical goal, which was that the Elder Wand's power had to die with him, and if Snape killed him on his own orders, then the Wand's allegiance would not truly pass, and Voldemort would take a weapon that did not answer to him. And this plan worked perfectly, except that it required Snape to live as a reviled traitor and die in agony, believing Harry would understand only after he was gone. And Dumbledore accepted this cost because he had decided Snape's suffering was acceptable in service of the larger outcome. What Dumbledore got right was that he understood the one variable Voldemort could not account for, which was love, not as sentiment, but as a force that created protection through willing sacrifice. And he saw that Lily's death created that protection in Harry's blood. And he saw that if Harry chose to die the same way, offering himself without fighting back, he would replicate that protection for everyone Voldemort threatened. And this was magically and psychologically sound. The idea that a soul could be tethered by love in a way that Horcrux is tethered through murder, and Dumbledore's entire plan rested on this, on the belief that Harry's choice would create a condition Voldemort could not break. And he was right. It worked. Harry's willingness to die was what allowed him to come back, and was what made Voldemort's final spells powerless. And this was not luck or sentiment. This was Dumbledore understanding magic at a level Voldemort's arrogance prevented him from reaching. He also got the Elder Wand problem right, because he knew that Voldemort would come for the wand, would seek it as a tool that made him invincible, and Dumbledore arranged his own death in a way that broke the wand's chain of allegiance. And even when Draco Malfoy accidentally became the wand's master by disarming Dumbledore before Snape killed him, Dumbledore had created enough uncertainty that Voldemort looked in the wrong place, opened the wrong tomb, and never realized that the wand answered the boy standing in front of him. And this was tactical brilliance, the ability to turn his own death into a move that weakened his enemy 2 steps down the line. But what Dumbledore got wrong was the emotional cost of secrecy, the way that withholding information from people who trusted you created damage, even when the outcome was successful. And we saw this most clearly with Sirius, because Dumbledore knew Sirius was innocent, knew he was suffering in Azkaban for a crime he did not commit, and did nothing for 12 years because he decided that Sirius in prison was strategically safer than Sirius free and potentially compromised. And even after Sirius escaped, Dumbledore kept him trapped in Grimmauld Place, isolated and bitter, because he needed Sirius alive but controlled. And this led directly to Sirius's death, because a man who had been caged and dismissed would eventually take a reckless risk just to feel like he still had agency. And Dumbledore's failure here was not that he made a cold calculation, but that he did not account for the psychological reality that people who were not trusted would not act in trustworthy ways. That control created the very recklessness it was supposed to prevent. He made the same mistake with Harry, not in the final choice, which Harry did make freely, but in the years of partial truths and delayed explanations. Because Harry was not stupid. He knew he was being managed. And this created resentment that surfaced again and again in 5th year when Harry felt abandoned, in 6th year when he did not understand why Dumbledore was so focused on Voldemort's past. And the damage was not that Harry stopped trusting Dumbledore, but that he learned to trust him the way you trusted someone who you knew was using you even if you believed their intentions were good. And this was a specific kind of relationship damage that did not break the bond but did introduce a permanent wariness, a sense that love and manipulation were not opposites but could operate simultaneously in the same relationship. The ring was Dumbledore's clearest mistake in judgment, because he found the resurrection stone, the hallow that could supposedly bring back the dead, and despite everything he knew about the dangers of trying to undo death, despite his own history with Ariana and the guilt he carried, he put on the ring without proper caution because he wanted to see her again, wanted to apologize, wanted to undo the one mistake that had defined his entire life. And this was a moment where his psychology betrayed him, where the man who had spent decades avoiding power because he did not trust himself with it made a choice driven purely by personal desire. And the ring was cursed, and the curse was fatal, and he survived only because Snape contained it, temporarily. And this was important because it revealed that Dumbledore was not beyond the same emotional vulnerabilities he manipulated in others, that his carefully constructed logic could be overridden by grief, and that he was capable of the same short-sighted choices he engineered others to avoid. There was also a fundamental arrogance in the greater good framework that Dumbledore never fully escaped, which was the assumption that he was qualified to make these calculations, that he could weigh lives and suffering and outcomes and arrive at the objectively correct answer. And this was the same arrogance he learned to fear in his youth, but repackaged as humility, because he told himself he was not seeking power, he was protecting people from his own capacity for corruption. But in practice, he was still making unilateral decisions about other people's lives, still deciding that his strategic vision outweighed their need for honesty or agency. And the fact that he felt guilty about this did not mean he stopped doing it. It just meant he suffered while doing it. And there was a kind of moral self-indulgence in that, in the idea that your own suffering justified the suffering you caused others because at least you felt bad about it. If we imagine an alternate path, we were asking what changed if Dumbledore told Harry the truth earlier, if he sat him down in fourth year after Voldemort's return and said, "You are a Horcrux, and at some point, you will need to let him kill you." And the question was whether Harry could carry that knowledge for 3 years without it destroying him, whether a teenager could function normally while knowing he was living on borrowed time. And Dumbledore's calculation was that he could not, that the weight of that knowledge would make Harry either reckless or paralyzed. And there was psychological validity to this. The idea that some truths were too heavy to carry until the moment they became actionable, but there was also a counter-argument, which was that Harry had proven again and again that he was capable of carrying unbearable knowledge, that he processed trauma by confronting it rather than avoiding it, and that giving him the full picture might have allowed him to prepare emotionally in ways that Dumbledore's sudden revelation did not permit. The deeper question was whether honesty would have changed the outcome, whether Harry's choice in the forest was meaningful because he made it without full knowledge, or whether it would be more meaningful if he walked in knowing exactly what Dumbledore had planned. And this was a difference between chosen sacrifice and engineered martyrdom, because if Harry knew he was raised for this, if he understood that every protection, every lesson, every test was designed to bring him to this exact moment, did he still have agency, or was he just executing a script someone else wrote? And Dumbledore's answer seemed to be that agency required ignorance, that a choice was only real if the person making it did not know they were inside someone else's plan. But this was a very specific philosophical position that treated awareness as corruptive and ignorance as protective, and it was not obvious that this was correct. What made Dumbledore's character psychologically consistent was that he never stopped operating from the wound of Ariana's death, never stopped believing that his own ambition was dangerous and had to be contained. And so, he built a life where he had enormous influence but no formal power, where he shaped events but always from the margins. And he told himself this was humility, but it was actually a form of control that was more total than any official position could provide, because it allowed him to act without accountability, to move pieces without having to justify his moves to anyone except himself. And this was the trap of the guilty manipulator, the person who believed they were protecting the world from themselves while actually creating conditions where no one could check their decisions because no one else had the full picture. If we change a choice, we change the person. And if Dumbledore chose transparency over control, if he trusted Harry with a plan instead of engineering his ignorance, we would get a different Harry, one who was perhaps less innocent but more autonomous, and we would get a different Dumbledore, one who was less haunted but also less dramatically effective. Because the plan that worked was the one where Harry did not know he was part of it, where his choice felt entirely his own even though. It was carefully constructed to arrive at exactly this point, and the uncomfortable truth was that the manipulation succeeded, the greater good was served, the world was saved, and the boy lived, and none of that changed the fact that it required treating a child as a tactical asset for 16 years, and whether that was forgivable depended on whether we believed outcomes justified methods, and whether we believed love could coexist with instrumentalization, and whether we believed someone could genuinely care about a person they were simultaneously willing to sacrifice. The question was not whether Dumbledore loved Harry, he did, in his own complicated way, but whether that love was ever separate from the plan, whether Harry was ever seen as a person rather than a necessary piece. And the answer the story gave was that both were true simultaneously, that Dumbledore's capacity for care and his capacity for calculation were not opposing forces but deeply intertwined, and that he was most dangerous precisely when he believed he was acting from love, because that was when he gave himself permission to make choices no one should make alone, and the greater good became whatever he decided it was, and the cost became whatever he decided someone else could bear. He raised a child to die and called it love, and the child chose to die anyway and lived, and the plan worked, and the world was saved, and none of that answered whether it was right. If you're interested in analyses that aren't meant to comfort, but to ask the questions stories try to avoid, you can subscribe for more.